Somebody else will have to take notes because I'm not at, I'm on my phone. So,
Steve, I'll take notes.
all right. So let's go ahead and get started. So today is Thursday, May 13th, the Ortelius architecture meeting. So just kind of want to pick up where we kind of left off from last time with the Swagger, bringing the Swagger information into Ortelius at the component level. And I've been doing some thinking on this, and I've been going back and forth. I'm kind of on the fence on whether we should bring in the Swagger YAML or JSON into Ortelius and store it in our database, or if we should just leave it as a pointer to where it exists, externally, or we do like an optional thing. Those are like the three thought processes I have around it. The first one, where we bring it into Ortelius, we can tightly couple it to the version of the component. So we can, we don't have to worry about the getting out of sync or drift between an external file and the component version that we're going to be like moving around and deploying and tracking. If we do go the route of the pointing to an external file or external URL, less things we have to store, but we'll have to figure out if somebody's not using something like Swagger Hub, and if they just have it like in a Git repo, how to handle those use cases. And then like the third option is we just kind of, design the UI so they could do either or on that front. So just want to throw that out there, get some feedback on that. Just to give a little context to it, the goal would be to enable from Ortelius to bring up the Swagger, for lack of a better word, UI inside of Ortelius. I looked, there is some JavaScript that we can bring in to render up the YAML or JSON, and then be able to have all the endpoints and the parameters and all the documentation there. So that's kind of the goal will be allow people to go ahead and see what the contracts are from inside of a component version. So just to throw that out there, get some thoughts.
So basically we're talking about having a cache of these Swagger files internally in Ortelius, and my question about whether that makes sense or not boils down to two things. Like, A, how much are we going to want to come back and reprocess the same data, and so saving us a round trip to whatever the external thing is could be reducing latency or expense and making our lives better. And how much is how we're going to process this stuff going to change? Like if we 1.0, we can process like 50% of the data in Swagger. Would we want to come back in a month or 6 months and reprocess that data once we can more richly pull stuff out of it? And so not having to re-retrieve it would make that much faster.
Yeah, I think on the way I understand that Swagger works is you have I can't remember if it's YAML or JSON or if it'll handle both. But basically you have the file, and then you throw the file at a Swagger JavaScript library. And then from there, it will basically render up the documentation sections, and then like the little entry fields if you want to go ahead and test something. So that is where we would be embedding basically a Swagger JavaScript engine into Ortelius to do that work. So if we have, and that's done on the fly. So you process the Swagger YAML file at the time that you want to visualize it. So it's not something like you pre-process and then you get the Swagger UI as an end result. It's kind of done as an input file, if that makes sense.
So are we merely like using this Swagger stuff to be able to present additional information to the user, or are we trying to extract data from that and store that in the database somewhere else that might be useful from a metadata perspective?
It would be for, initially, it would be for people to see visually what the endpoints are and the parameters for the endpoints, you know, and that documentation around the endpoints. So from a microservices perspective, you have your microservice. Right now, we have no way to document what the endpoint is for that microservice, and bringing in the Swagger would be the easy way to get a lot of bonus points from the developers. So they can look at the version of the microservice, and there is the Swagger documentation right next to it. Now for like the data, you know, gathering data around like the transactions that the microservice is using, and like using like the Swagger JSON file to look for transactions. I think that would be down the road when we try to tie in telemetry.
So if we're not really like processing the data and integrating it, we're just basically just having this sort of bag on the side to give people additional useful information, then the question boils down to like, how reliably do you feel like you're going to continue to be able to retrieve that information, or do you want to store it in a cache so that it doesn't look like Ortelius is unreliable just because some other backend system isn't up at the moment?
Yeah, I think yeah, that makes perfect sense. Where we would want to cache it so we can ensure that we can display the data without having to worry about an external resource being available. That's my thought process right now.
Yeah, I want to share something. Usually when you go to the contract first world, when I want to call it Open API because Swagger is right now is a standard. So when you call Swagger, is like you're directly working with Swagger. So in the Open API specification and contract first is a whole life cycle for the integration perspective. So usually if you contract first, usually you are going to have a life cycle from this specification, and you're going to need to implement some kind of tooling to do this workflow working, for avoiding like contracts being like, I don't know, sync with the implementation and stuff like that. So I'm seeing, or the project we use contract first as a life cycle. You're going to use tooling like Apicurio for managing the implementation. You're going to need to do a registry. So Confluent, I think, is the one the last time I used it, and then you're going to start using some stuff like micros first you take the you take the contract, then you implement it with Apicurio, and then with micros you start doing like the validation that you need for that API, and finally you include all that in your CI/CD or deployment structure to be sure you're going to have this thing with your implementation. The thing is, working with contract fear is impacts in the way you're going to develop. So if
Right.
I think if we are going to go to Open API, probably we are going to start doing changing all the life cycle of developing, because people who want to implement some change, you are going to start with the contract, updating the specification, the methods, what it's going to do, the metadata, and then you are going to generate your structure and then doing the change. So my thoughts are that working with Open API is a whole life cycle of API managing the API itself and the development too. So that's our
Yeah.
my thought. We need to implement like a few more tools to hang out with all this information. Of course, you can just put in the Swagger library and publishing some your API for a specific microservice maybe. But yeah, at the time, you're going to need create all this flow.
Yeah, because what I'm thinking is all we want to do is provide or this is my idea, is that we want to provide a place for an easy place to find the documentation for a microservice. And how we get that documentation associated to that microservice could come out of the CI/CD process, like you said, where the contracts change, you go through the registry, and then you run some tool to generate your Swagger, basically. So I think that part of the life cycle is a little bit too early for us, and we want to pick up after all that work's been done and they're getting ready to push it to a registry, or when the Docker build's been completed, that we can grab a Swagger file at that point. That's my thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I was sort of feeling like the life cycle stuff was mostly outside of what Ortelius was trying to present, but I did wonder, based on what Sergio said, does it make sense from a user interface perspective to be able to let people move back and forth between the history? We've got API version 1 and API version 2, and so if somebody's looking at a microservice that was released with API version 2, should they be able to go back and find API version 1 and whatever was associated with that? I don't know if that seems like it could be useful, but I don't know if it's really worth the trouble or not.
Well, that's built into Ortelius automatically. So we version components. So you'd have a version 1 of the component and then version 2 of the component. And that's why I was thinking of tightly coupling the Swagger for that version, in our database, so we don't get that drift. So you can actually do, like you're talking about, Christopher, go forward or backwards and look at the Swagger documentation between the two versions.
But I mean, isn't that just like coming from the component? Like if we had 3 components that were all using the Swagger API, there's nothing in Ortelius to say that those are sharing some common thing. Is there, or am I missing something?
No, you'd have those 3 components would, well, let's put it this way. We would be looking at it from the producer side and not the consumer side initially. So a microservice is going to produce an endpoint. That would be the Swagger that we would associate, would be, this is how you talk to this endpoint in this version of the microservice. And that's for component A. Now component B, version 3, is going to have its endpoint definition and the documentation around it. And then we have another, the component Z has version 20 with its endpoint definition that we have to it. If that's going to be on the producing side, but on the but we're not going to look at the consuming side. Z is consuming version 3 version component B. That I think it'll be down the road when we look like bringing in telemetry.
Yeah, I will like if we maybe have some session to work, like trying to put in some paper what are the what we want to resolve and what are the capability we have, and then do a little like roadmap for that to see, okay, on the stage 1 we are focusing on because we want to solve this. So having something like that, we are going to be able to see, okay, on the first step we need to implement like this, and maybe we can connect the pieces to the end as a good strategy to the thing we are building in increments can connect at the end and having maybe this whole life cycle that is going to help us. But I would like to have that big picture to know that every step we are doing is going to help for a final big solution for saying some way.
Okay, yeah, I can put that together. And that's a great idea. So we can make sure that we're covering all the bases.
I can help you with that if you want to.
Okay.
Is there an existing tool that people are using for presenting the Swagger information on the web and making it, clickable and that sort of thing? Should we be trying to integrate something like that instead of reinventing that wheel?
Karam did bring that up at the last meeting that there is a Swagger Hub. I'm not sure if it's just for like a public facing hub, or if you actually stand it up internally on your internal network, that type of thing.
Just a couple of things I wanted to comment on as well, and it's kind of related to that. One thing which I think is going to be important is to decouple contract-driven development from the Swagger/OpenAPI conversation. Some places will be using it as part of contract-driven development, but you'll also have a lot of places which are either just decorating the code with the Swagger library to generate a Swagger API file off the back of that, and some places just create it manually, which is suboptimal. So I think we're mainly talking about, regardless of if it's contract API driven development or generated from code or manually maintained one, the actual Swagger API artifact or the OpenAPI artifact, which is a JSON file. So initially, I don't think necessarily hooks into the overall contract testing lifecycle. On the visualization of Swagger, there's a million different ways, and I think this is part of a pain at the moment which folk have. So you've got Swagger Hub, which is, if I remember correctly, kind of public sharing. Most of the Swagger APIs the Swagger libraries themselves for .NET and Python and the like, you can actually stand up a web server essentially, or a port alongside the application which exposes the Swagger API directly. And it's just basically a static site generated from the JSON files and a couple other bits and pieces. So some places you'll have the services running with the Swagger API alongside of it, or people will need to pull the image down and then run it in order to see it. So there is tooling around there. I don't necessarily, from the investigation I've been doing, what we do internally, I don't think there's really a kind of standardized way outside of just using the built-in kind of Swagger library to expose it. There is definitely value in being able to associate a version of a component and even just initially just the API associated with what that's producing, because you do run into situations where different environments with different API versions, it can be quite hard to track that. And there is tooling around it, but it tends to go more along the lines of the contract-based testing, which can be a bit heavyweight for just, I want to know the API version associated with this version of the microservice, and then see what's in this other environment and see what the changes are. So I think that's an interesting area.
Yeah, and that's your last point there. That's the one that I think is going to be the easiest for us to bring in into Ortelius. Like you said, the contract and the contract testing, I think is out of our scope.
Yeah, I think we should write like this. What is the immediate needs, and just has a draft that how
Okay.
we're going to move in for that. So yeah, I think it's a good idea. The one I'm working with is just to like sharing information. We are used to work with Apicurio. That's because Red Hat is not a product of Red Hat, but in our offering for API lifecycle, we use that. So just
Okay.
if you want to check it.
Yeah, I'll get a document started here and get it shared to everybody, and we can start adding on. Basically start out with like a brain dump, what's out there, and then we can work on refining it, like you said, and build up a mini roadmap of this this area. Anybody have anything else on this? Okay, cool. Sergio, we got a couple minutes left. Do you just want to give us an update on the circuit breaker that you've been playing with and how that's going?
Okay. Well, I just do the what it says, the documentation, and yeah, it is simple to use as the demo because it's just a library. One comment on that, there are two ways to implement it. One is using a decorate, like adding over a method, like the, the implementation of the pipe breaker, and the other one is just coding like in a normal way. I have to say that the method decorated works for me, and the other one not. I don't know what it was about the version, but I'm just warning you if you're going to try that the other method doesn't work. At least for me, the last version of Python. Or that I can start the web microservice without having the database. Is have amount of retry and time between that retry, and now I'm implementing some health endpoint because I want to visualize what is doing the secret breaker inside. I want to the observability he offers. So the secret breaker has the count, has the try, has the state. So I'm exposing a little method to have visibility of that. And I want to from here to the early of the next week having a version that can visualize when the database is down and when the database is coming back. So that's pretty much the demo I want to finish.
All right, awesome. Yeah, so just put some context for people that missed. In our Python microservice code, we ran into this with Mooney and Beamy on their the She Codes Africa, where there's a a timing problem where the database wasn't starting quick enough for their microservice to start in Kubernetes. It was just the implementation, and so that's where Sergio wanted to take a look at PyBreaker to help deal with database connections that get broken or don't exist, and have an elegant way of recovering at the microservice level, at the Python level. The goal that I kind of threw out there in the issue is that we want to keep it simple. We don't want it to be overly complicated. And if we need to, exit out or, crash gracefully and let Kubernetes kind of kick us off and restart us. And that part is an option as well. And that's what he's looking at. So that's just some context of what we're doing at that point. One of the things when we look at this is is just having these microservices be small snippets of code that we're able to work with and not overly complicated, because then it just makes development and maintenance on them very much easier. So thank you for working on that. Anybody else have anything that I may have missed? All right, cool. There is if you're interested, it's going to be 4:30 Mountain Time today. We're going to do another architecture meeting with the Australian time zone. I think it ends up being like 8 or 8:30 Sydney time. So if you're interested on that, it's on the calendar. That group is focusing around GitOps and Ortelius interface into GitOps. So that's where there's like, I think 5 or 6 of them that are working on it. So if you're interested, you can join in that if it's not too late in the morning. Otherwise, it'll be recorded like this one, and the notes will be added to this document as well. Okay, cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining today, and everybody take care and stay safe.
Have a good one.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye.